Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Finlo Costain. Leicestershire-based dairy farmer Ruth Grice has published her Nuffield farming report, Working Together, How Dairy Farmers and Environmental Organisations Can Achieve Sustainable Food Security and Combat Climate Change. I spoke to Ruth and I asked her what's to be gained by working more closely with environmental groups.
A huge amount. I feel when I think of the climate and the biodiversity crisis that we're facing globally, within the UK at a local level, it feels like we're trying to climb Mount Everest. And the dairy farming community can give it a good shot at climbing Mount Everest on their own. But actually, we need to do it in partnership with other communities. And a key community to do that in partnership with is naturally the environmental sector. I think, if I just think of walking around some of the fields we have here on our own family dairy farm, I will look at that field in a very different way to someone from an environmental organisation. And marrying the two together can only be a good thing if it's done in the right way.
Just tell us briefly about your own farm, if you would, Ruth.
So it's a small family farm. We are milking 200 pedigree Holsteins. We're part of a small cooperative of 33 dairy farmers who are within Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire. And together we own Long Clawson Dairy, who make the world famous Stilton cheese. So in terms of the farm to factory story, our milk is produced here and then it's taken 5 miles down the road and turned into delicious cheeses that are sold throughout the UK and globally.
And are you seasonally grazing or fully indoor?
A little bit of both. So we have very, very heavy clay soil around here. So we graze when we're able to, when the ground is fit and the grass is growing. But as soon as the cows will start to poach that land, we want to look after the soil. They go back indoors. So if on a normal year, if there is such a thing anymore, they are grazing between April and October.
What do you think are the main problems between dairy farmers and environmentalists?
So before I started my Nuffield, I worked for Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust. I'd worked in the environmental NGO sector for around 15 years at that point. And I felt very much at home in both communities. I was working both at the trust and on the family dairy farm. And I could not work out why they kept coming up against this fractious feeling between the two communities, whether it's over how best to manage your land or how best to tackle bovine TB. So it wasn't until I had the opportunity, thanks to my sponsor, the AHDB, the Agriculture Horticulture Development Board, to go and do my Nuffield to see what that relationship was like in other countries. So I went to Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Wisconsin in the USA. And getting out of the UK made me see that there are 3 main pillars as to why there is sometimes a fractious relationship between the two communities. There's cultural heritage, there's economic heritage, and then there's political landscapes.
Do you think that the bad feeling towards dairy farmers is always based on misconceptions, or are some of the criticisms justified?
I think a lot of it, so yes and no, in answer to your question to begin with. I think that some of the antagonistic relationship is based on frustrations on both sides. But I think a lot of the time, the communication often isn't perhaps as good as it could be. And that communication channel at the moment, I feel, is often based around shame and judgment, which creates barriers, which creates defensive language, which puts people's backs up, which creates disengagement. So it might be that dairy farmers, for example, are operating within a system. They're doing things on their farm that they feel they need to do to make a profit, or at least try and make a profit in a very volatile global marketplace. That could be perceived by the environmental sector as not caring about the environment, about just doing whatever it takes to make a quick buck.
Is the shame and judgment that you've mentioned mostly coming from the environmental community towards farmers?
I think it's both, personally. So when I was working in the Wildlife Trust movement, I was hoping to be able to forge a career path where I could bring the two communities together in a post-Brexit world where we had control over our own agricultural policies, where both communities wanted to achieve sustainable food security and combat climate change. But when I would go to meetings in the farming community to talk about how that could be achieved, knowing that they had to partner with environmental organisations to make real progress, I would hear the environmental community being described in ways I had never encountered. And the same happened on the other side. I would go to meetings at the wildlife trusts that were there to brainstorm ways they could work better in partnership with local farmers. And again, I'd hear stories of farmers that I'm not taking it away from anybody's experience, but I had never encountered that. So it works both ways.
Was the situation similar in all of the countries that you visited?
I definitely felt it in Denmark, where they now have an emissions tax on carbon emissions. And I felt it in the Netherlands as well. So I have a very close friend, a school friend who I stayed with in the Netherlands. She's not part of the farming community. And even she was very aware of how farmers are perceived in the Netherlands. So it felt quite a widespread antagonistic relationship between farmers, dairy farmers, and environmental organisations and the wider public. In Sweden, I was quite surprised, actually. I didn't realise until I was there, but in 2018, the government made a real push to increase domestic food security. So farmers are encouraged to produce as much food as they can do, not at any cost. And in America as well, it felt like they were trying to achieve their environmental targets by seeking greater efficiencies on their farms. So it was all about production, and that it shifted the narrative slightly. I came away feeling that the farmers in those two countries, in America, in Wisconsin at least anyway, and Sweden, felt more empowered to do what was right on their land, primarily to produce food, but also to do that in a way that protected and enhanced the natural environment by working in partnership with other organisations.
Do you think that there's a difference in the conversation where the farmers are focused on the delivery of net zero, which can often lead to a greater industrialisation of agriculture, where methane emissions, for example, can be micromanaged in the cattle shed, or whether the policy drive and the media drive is towards a more holistic and regenerative sense of nature restoration?
I do understand this. I do understand why we have climate targets and net zero targets. They're really important. They create a vision, a North Star, however you wish to describe it, a really strong direction of travel. But I do worry that there is a risk that they can also create smoke and mirrors within the supply chain, and that it could end up in a race to the bottom where it's all about the essentially the carbon balance sheets, what figures are on that piece of paper, regardless of how that farm has got there. And often, it's important we have targets that try and reduce our carbon emissions as quickly as possible. But these things take time. And you could have a situation where you have a small family farm or a family business, and different generations within that family want to do things differently, but that doesn't happen overnight. It might take a shift of 5, 10, 15 years, but better to get there in a sustainable way. And I do feel that about regenerative farming. It's a shift, it's a mind shift, and that will take time. And they don't always equate to immediately lowering your carbon audits figures.
While it may be possible to overcome negative attitudes towards the cattle themselves, it seems unlikely that environmentalists are ever going to support the increasingly industrialised and fossil fuel reliant model of dairying. Do we need to see a faster shift towards regenerative dairy models?
I think for me, with my dairy farming hat on, I feel we do need to be honest about the outputs that will come from regenerative ways of farming. So on our own farm, if I think how this farm was managed when my grandfather and great-grandfather purchased it in the 1950s, outputs were very, very different, but perhaps, very, very suited to the farm at the time and the land they had available. We have completely changed the way we farm. My forefathers wouldn't recognise the farm and the way it operates today. So to shift away and move towards more regenerative practices that suits the system we're trying to work within, it will take a while to get our heads around, but we need to look after our land. That's non-negotiable. We need to look after our soils. We need to look after our water, our air quality. We need to be active and a healthy part of our local communities. We can't exist without any of those things.
You mentioned your own background working for a wildlife trust. Do you think that pressure from environmentalists helps or hinders progress towards a more regenerative dairy system?
I think before my Nuffield travels, I would have said yes. You know, we need that push, you need that impetus to move things along. But seeing the impact that shame and pressure, which I kind of link together, can have, I would err towards it would have negative impacts.
So how do we do that? How do you think farmers can begin to improve relationships with environmental groups in order to achieve that more positive dialogue?
Again, something I wasn't expecting to find, but I feel like the wider supply chain has a huge role to play. I started my Nuffield Farming Scholarship thinking of the relationship purely between active dairy farmers and environmental organisations, but quickly found that the role of dairy processors, for example, including the one I now work for, Long Clawson Dairy, who we sell our milk to, is absolutely huge. So earlier this year, I put my money where my mouth was. I set up a meeting, invited lots of environmental organisations around to Long Clawson Dairy, a meet and greet, a brainstorm as to how we could work best together. Come and see the factory, come and sample our perspective for a day. And I know that our active dairy farmers, our shareholders in our business, they couldn't have done that. I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all, but it's our dairy farmers are incredibly busy people, really busy people. Even, you know, just to keep up with the milking shifts of a typical day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, takes up a heck of a lot of time and resource. The dairy processors have more options, wider time availability, wider resources to have those conversations and then bring the two communities together. And I wasn't anticipating that before my travels, but I've definitely come away feeling that they have a greater role to play in bringing the two communities together.
That was Ruth Grice, whose report can be found on the Nuffield Farming website. More news as ever on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.